Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Ed Knab, and I'm part of an association of professional material handling consultants called the APMHC. That's the Association of Professional Material Handling Consultants. And we welcome you to our presentation on 5 core principles for achieving world-class performance on your WMS system. First of all, I wanted to tell you a little bit about APMHC. We're an organization that works with people in the distribution arena to help make sure that they get the right product to do the right job. And that's really been our focus. We have 23 members. We're all independent. We don't represent any product or any singular product or service. But we're trying to find the right product for the right application, and that's our goal and that's our objective. I've been working in this industry for about 25 years, and when I started, really there were very few WMS systems around, and those systems that were around only had limited applications and flexibility. I was in the hardware distribution business, and we were distributing very small parts to lots of clients on a direct basis all around the country. And we wanted to automate the process, and we wanted to figure out how to do that. And really, the starting point was to assess and determine what it was we wanted to accomplish, and then find some experts in the field that could tell us how to do that. We ended up having to develop our own WMS, and that's when I met my associate, Don Benson. Don has been in the industry a bit longer, some 25 or 30 years, and was very instrumental in the initial WMS systems that were established, and has been implementing them or been involved in working with them for over 25 years. So maybe to get started, I'd like to find out what we have here in the audience. How many people are in the distribution business here in the audience? So we have quite a few distributors. How many people do e-commerce here? Do we have any e-commerce people? Good. So a couple. And how about manufacturers? Are there any manufacturing companies looking for WMS help? Good, excellent. All right, well, there's people come here from all different perspectives, and one of the most important things is trying to figure out exactly what your needs are, because your needs are going to be different than the next person's. And that's one of the things that we want to accomplish at this session. So we're going to do a presentation. Don is going to walk you through the 5 elements, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So let me introduce my associate, Mr. Don Benson.
Thank you, Ed. I'm also interested in knowing how many people might be interested in buying a WMS now, sometime in the not too distant future.
Quite a few.
Quite a few, good. How many of you have a warehouse management system now and would like to get more out of it?
Good.
Oh, good. That's where we're coming from. I think that what we have to say will be useful to both. So let's begin. I was thinking there was one other question, but not now. So the question starts with, what does a warehouse management, world-class distribution mean to you? Do you have some thoughts about that? What does world-class really mean to you? Have you thought about that? No? Okay, so our goal is that as a potential objective that we might want to investigate. Our position is that world-class is a judgment that's provided by others. That isn't something that we achieve by virtue of the fact that we brought brand X, brand Y, or brand Z, but it's when we meet the objectives, exceed the expectations of our customers, of our stakeholders. We believe that it's transitory, it happens for a little while, and if somehow or other management changes or customers changes, the market changes, we may be world-class for a while and we might not later. And so how is it that we maintain our energy and our success at moving in that direction? Got to check up with my notes, make sure I don't get off track here. A warehouse management system, we believe, was created from two perspectives. One is that it was software to improve management. And the second is that it was a database that we could use for a lot of technologies that are available on the floor here today to supplement, to help improve the productivity of the people who are doing the work. And we wanted to make sure that that was in your mind, because sometimes we lose track of the fact that there's a management component there. And our effectiveness at managing the warehouse has to do with how well we use the technologies that we install. Sometimes we lose track of that, I think, in the process. So we want to start with the notion of what is the management function? How does management come into a warehouse management system? Years ago, when I took a class in management, they told me that there were 5 functions. And I've been trying to think about how do those 5 functions play out in the warehouse. The first is, for me, for us, and for my clients, it's been, how do we plan? How do we plan for the day so that it's not a reaction, that we're actually in a planning mode, that we have some idea about what's expected for the day, we've got some plan for the carriers that are going to pick up, we maybe even have some plan for the material that's coming in, we may even have some idea of how much work we're going to do today. Once we have that as a plan, we can begin to do something constructive with the rest of the operation through the WMS. The second thing is to organize it. And that's what came up with the notion of waving early on. The idea was that there's a sequence in which we want to intentionally move the orders through the warehouse. Maybe it's in a route delivery system. We want to have the nose loads, the last to be delivered, the first ones out. Minimize the staging on the floor. Maybe it's because we want to equalize or normalize or standardize the weight load across the axles in a vehicle. So we want to have the goods come out in a sequence that would minimize the staging on a shipping dock. So there's lots of ways in which we can create a notion of organizing. One of the natural consequences beyond what I've just said is that it can help us with regard to understanding the staffing. If waving was a concept that we developed some years ago that was developed out of an old industrial engineering term called short interval scheduling, which took the day and broke it down into periods so that we could monitor our progress through the day as a primitive mode of feedback around how are we doing, so that we don't wait till 30 minutes before the end of the shift to discover that we need more people or we need some overtime or so on. We'll know that as we're monitoring through the day. And so this provides us an opportunity to begin to understand what staffing requirements might be as well. Obviously, we now have the ability to take an order and break it into several components and pick it simultaneously in several different areas. From a staffing perspective, in a waving perspective, we can begin to do some labor planning and understand how many people we need in each work area, wave by wave by wave, and make sure that we get a good utilization out of the resources that we have. The directing part has to do, in our mind, with the methods and procedures. Sometimes into re-engineering. Oftentimes that's a way in which we get involved in design, and we'll talk about that a little bit better. But the directing part has to do with providing instructions, providing a way to provide guidance to the people in doing the work. Controlling was our method of measuring performance, to get some idea, as I mentioned earlier, about how we're doing wave to wave to wave, to get some idea of feedback so that we're not in a large facility, not able to have access to everybody, not be able to see everybody, to know how things are going, what kind of feedback mechanisms were available that we could get some information and do a better job of control. And it's a circular phenomenon. That is to say, when we get the information from what happened yesterday, then we've got a better understanding about how well the planning worked with the staff, how well it worked with the supervisors. So there's a feedback mechanism in terms of how do we plan and what's the results, and how do we plan and how it's the results. So the person now, who oftentimes is responsible, called the planner, is a peer and has an engagement every day with the people who are actually supervising the work that needs to be done, so that there's a continuous improvement opportunity, recognizing that today is different from yesterday, is different from the day before, so that we recognize that it's not a level playing field every day. We even get involved in understanding the cycles. The end of month is sometimes different than the beginning, or the 15th, or the end of the week is sometimes different than Monday. So how do we build the patterns in order to do a better job of planning? The other part of it that I mentioned earlier was that the WMS ended up being a huge and powerful database. And with that database, we now have the opportunity to improve the productivity, both with such simple things like a locator system, which should be fundamental, but with RF communications, with RFID, with order management, with barcodes, with automatic storage and retrieval systems. There's lots of ways with technologies available to work off that database to do a better job of helping the people with their productivity. And that's important. It's critical, and that provides us the opportunity to use lots of the technologies that are out there on the floor today. I just want to make sure that we recognize there's a management component, and there was a database that allows us to connect to those technologies. So we believe that fundamentally most warehouse management systems out here on the floor that you might meet are pretty good. We're not in a position to want to evaluate and say one's better than another. It may in fact be true for your particular facility, some unique aspects, but generally speaking, they wouldn't be here and be relatively successful if they weren't pretty good. So the point then becomes for us, and we found this to be true, that you could, in many examples, where the same vendor was installed in two different facilities, and in one they were tremendously successful, and the other they weren't. And so as we began to understand that and do some work with clients where they weren't particularly successful, we found that a significant portion of the success is how well they used it, how well they understand it, how well it was integrated, not from a purposes of technology, but in a technology integration perspective, but in a business integration perspective. How well it interfaced and integrated with warehouse operations, and how well it interfaced with business objectives. So there's a whole dimension of integration that for the most part doesn't get dealt with well. Oftentimes it's talked about from a training perspective. We're not interested so much in training to the extent that you fill in the blanks right, that sort of thing. We're interested in how this all fits together, and that's a learning process. It's sort of like, I like to use the example of, so you want to go out and buy an airplane. Well, the vendor doesn't ask you if you have a license to fly that airplane. You got the money, you buy it, and now what you're going to do with it. The same is sort of like a warehouse management system. It isn't like a forklift. You buy it, you learn how to use it. That's the process, and it's a continuous process. You get better and better and better at it over time. It's not just trained in the initial startup. It's how do you maintain a relationship with your stakeholders, with your managers, and so on, with your planner, with your operations supervisors. How do we continue to improve day after day after day? Because people change, and how do we build the infrastructure so that the person who comes in to replace you knows something about how to do this so that they can stand on your shoulders to continue to improve upon it. So our point is that it's in the implementation process, and the implementation process never ends. So there are 5 core principles that we feel are critical here. The first is the vision. And the vision, we've heard lots about vision. I'm sure we've all seen it in a lot of places. For us, it was, what is it that the vision of the company, what is it the vision of the warehouse in order to have a warehouse management system? And the differentiation, crisp, is the vision isn't to have, in my opinion, a WMS. The vision is to create a different level of performance, a different kind of what I call desired outcomes, a different way of working together, a different way of solving our stakeholder requirements. That's the kind of vision that we're interested in talking about. The second is understanding what those stakeholder requirements are, to really engage with those folks who care about who we are, and we'll get into this a little bit more, to detail, really understand what those requirements are so that we can move on to create the manifestation of this warehouse management system in your facility that meets those requirements. The third part that I find often is ignored and not even thought of, not even ignored, it skips over, we don't notice, is that most of the people, particularly in a warehouse that's never had a warehouse management system, really don't know much about operations of a warehouse. They know their little niche. They know their piece. But they don't understand that there are lots of ways to do that particular piece of work. There are lots of methods and procedures to work well together, and we're going to get deeper into this in a minute. So there's a huge opportunity to take the people, and we've done this a lot, to take the people who are thinking about a new warehouse management system and move them over to see what their peers might look like through a professional organization, through tours for former clients, have them opportunity to see that there's more than one way to pick and load. There's more than one way to schedule a receiving dock. There's more than one way to replenish a forward pick location. Each one has a logic behind it, and once we understand that there's more than one way to do it, we can make the right kind of design decisions. Critical piece, the first piece that got me back into this work, was that the majority of the impact of a warehouse management system, in my experience, requires a re-engineering. And to the extent that many are now thinking of the warehouse management system as a kind of a commodity, that we're looking for the cheapest price, and in our process to get in for the cheapest price, we take out those things that are variable. And one of the variables is, well, let's re-engineer the operation. Well, as soon as we take that out, there are very, very few facilities I've been in where they've really engineered themselves to a good position. And as a consequence, not having done that re-engineering, we find that the things that weren't working well, or the things that were taken care of by Joe in the corner but nobody knows what Joe's doing, all of a sudden those things get bad faster than Joe can take care of them. And we've had a number of instances in which it was just a real problem because the senior manager, trying to save the most on the purchase of the WMS, decided, well, we'll just do it the way we've always done it. And I can assure you that's a real risk, huge risk. And if I could say at the moment, this WMS is probably the most powerful and potentially the most risky investment that you can make. It's not going to come out in the press. The press doesn't tell you about the failures. The press won't report the fact that there's a survey. It's a little bit dated now, but there was a survey a few years ago that said that 41% of warehouse management system owners are happy with the result. 41%. And they're smart people out there. They're as smart as you are, and perhaps smarter, and they aren't happy with the results. So what can we do up front? Well, it's back to, if you're going to buy that airplane, let's make real sure you know how to fly. Otherwise, you or somebody's going to get hurt, and the company oftentimes. And the last piece is, so we've got a robust design, and the last piece is the measurement. And that is, and we've all done it, you know, we create an ROI calculation that justifies the investment. How many of us actually go back afterward and validate that data? Anybody? One. Congratulations. It doesn't happen much. And without that measurement, we don't know whether we're making the kind of outcomes that we want. We're getting the return that we want. All we know is we went through this, oh my goodness, change, and we're certainly not significantly, in my experience, we're not significantly moving down that path toward the world class, or at least a reasonable competitive advantage against our peers. So I'm going to go back through these one more time. The vision, a clear, articulated vision for distribution warehouse. So for example, at a business level, we want our costs to improve. We also want to differentiate in the market. We want to provide some quicker service, quicker response time. We want to do something that makes the business think that the distribution warehouse is of some value. What is it that they want? What is it the president wants? What does the sales force want? We get them involved in understanding that we're just not a necessary evil, but the distribution warehouse can be competitive, can create something that would be useful. All of a sudden we get a different level of support. And of course, from an operations perspective, we're interested in agility. We recognize that the demand day to day varies and will hopefully change over time, that we're interested in good quality, we're interested in throughput. We want to be able to get more through that funnel in a reasonable period of time, or an 8-hour shift or something. Those are good operations objectives, desired outcomes that we're really interested in, and they become really critical in the next step, in the educational process, in the requirements process, in the design. Once we're real clear about what those objectives are, we've got something to guide us through the rest of the process to make sure that we achieve those objectives. And oftentimes I've seen that the objectives come out and then we forget about them. Oh, they went up on the wall someplace, or they ended up in somebody's file cabinet, but they weren't regular reminders as a criteria. Do we want to do this? Do we want to do it this way? Do we want to do it that way? Does it meet those objectives? The second is the requirements. And I make a real point here about the notion of stakeholders. It's a term you've probably all heard. Who has a stake in our operation? We'll get into it a little bit deeper in a moment. Who are they and what are their requirements? And my experience is, unless we ask them, we don't know. At best, what we're going to do is look at the past. Maybe we'll look at our current problems. Somebody just called me today and said, oh, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. That's not really requirements. That's just a bump in the road. The requirements are, where are we going to go from here? And how will we, doing our work, help them be more successful at what they're doing? Because we're interdependent here. We may be off 40 miles or 100 miles or whatever from the operations management of the company, but the reality, we're intertwined like this. And if we're not really in touch with those folks, if the only time we hear from them is when they call us, we don't really know what their objectives are. We don't know what their requirements are. So there's a relationship piece there. The third, so a part of that that's really important to me is this notion of levels of system. So I want to point out, so for me, a warehouse has all these elements in it. Probably a few more, but there's a limit in terms of space here. And unless they're all there and working well together, we don't really have a warehouse. We got a building. A good, well-functioning warehouse. All of these contribute to the warehouse, and each one of them, by the lines that we've got illustrating the connection between them, each one is a customer of each other. So they're all stakeholders. Shipping is a stakeholder for picking. What does shipping need? What does picking need from inventory in order to do a good job? How do we then collaborate one with another around this process? Then the warehouse comes together. There's a button here that, oh, there it is. Sweet new tools. So all of these are parts, all of these departments are part of the company. All of them have a need for understanding what's going on in the warehouse. All of them care about what's going on in the warehouse. So when we start getting involved with the stakeholders and understanding requirements, we need to contact these people and not just send them a survey. Ask them to come down and let's talk about this. Then we'll find out. Maybe find out even the things that they weren't thinking about in terms of how we might serve them so that they could do their job better. When all of these are working well, we've got a really effective company exists in a supply chain. So when we think about designing our requirements and our stakeholders, do we talk to our customers? Do we talk to the local government? Do we talk to our carriers and vendors so that we have a good relationship, a good understanding about what they need from us rather than what we think we need? So that when we do our design, so we've got some reporting systems coming out of the WMS, that it meets their needs proactively rather than after the fact. Oops, there we go. The other aspect about requirements that I think is really fun is the notion that we could look backward and remember what's been required of the past. And it's important to do a sort of a data analysis. What kind of patterns, what kind of trends, what kind of predictable variability, all that sort of stuff. Internal. We're just looking at what the data that we have. We just go round and round and round. We make mathematical projections into the future. Really good at that. I'm suggesting, no, that's reactive and responsive to what's happened in the past and what's going on now, the problems that we're trying to solve. The challenge was that is as soon as you get that facility turned on with a new WMS, it solved the problems that were a week ago, a month ago, 9 months ago, whenever it was. It's not anticipatory. It didn't talk with those stakeholders about what do we need tomorrow? What do they need a month after now? What are we going to do now with a WMS to prepare for the Panama Canal opening up? 2014, it's going to have a huge impact on a lot of distribution centers. Inbound flow, response time. I don't know what it's going to be for you, but that's a real critical one that's on the horizon that we know about. We know what's coming. If we don't talk to somebody about that who may be more in touch with that, maybe it's purchasing, I don't know, but if we don't talk with them about that, we did a great job of solving the problems of yesterday, but we haven't anticipated tomorrow. Not that we're going to get them all, but if we get out and deal with that supply chain and find out what their issues are, we're going to be much better prepared than we were before, and we've designed a warehouse management system that will have a higher probability of meeting your desired outcomes, meeting your needs. So when you think the last part about requirements is this notion that once you develop those requirements, as I try to point out, you've developed a relationship with people. Not just with roles, not just with the salesman from a particular company or a buyer from another company, but the people within them. What happens, of course, over time is the roles remain the same and the people change. So how do we maintain a relationship with the people that are new? Because reality is, over time, relationships create our tasks, and the tasks need to get back to the requirements, and we just keep going through this circle so that as we want greater capacity, greater agility, greater viability, through complexity and throughput, that we keep moving back and forth, and we have the opportunity to change these tasks and requirements and technologies based upon the stakeholder requirements that change too, so that it isn't just install and forget, but we install and we recognize that this thing needs to change over time. And how do we get information that knows how to do that? How do we do that? How do we create the foundation, even in the selection of the WMS vendor, having some understanding about what the issues are, what's the process, because we're not going to run this thing the same way a year from now. We might but the rest of the industry is going to move on. And if we don't move on with them, we're in trouble. We then end up being the inhibitor to the next stage in the company's maintaining its potential world-class operation. So we talked about vision, and we talked about requirements, and I mentioned briefly the notion about education. And that's really critical to me around how do people understand what they fit into. We all talk about employee involvement to some extent, but what does that mean? To me, it's an educational process. How do they learn about what purchasing is about? How do they understand what the vendors care about? How do we do that? There's lots of ways to do that, but believe me, I believe strongly, it's not just training. It's exposure, it's conversation with the management and staff. So it's a critical piece, and it becomes even more critical at the next step in design. We do a re-engineering design. If we've got half the people in the warehouse, in the participating that have never been outside the four walls of your warehouse, they might as well not be there. They can't contribute. We'd like to think they can, but if they've never been outside, they're going to continue to parrot back the same thing that they've been doing for years and years. That's the way we've always done it. How do we get beyond that? There's lots and lots and lots of ways to do that, and it's been hugely effective for us. It builds a greater sense of connection, a greater sense of professionalism on their part. They become more useful to you. They understand more about what the warehouse management system is going to do for them in terms of how it will help them do things differently and do things better. And if for no other reason, it'll make them more productive with less effort, because they've come up with the right designs. They have an ownership in the design. They feel aligned with it, so when it gets delivered by us brilliant engineers, they'll say, you know, you're not just doing it to me. You know, we've got something here that really works, and I understand it. So that education piece becomes really valuable in the design. And so that, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the re-engineering becomes critical for us. That also speaks to also understanding what sort of technologies are out here. So when they have an opportunity to tend to show, maybe not everyone, maybe a lead or two, having an opportunity to begin to understand there's a real productivity advantage. We can make it quicker, we can make it easier, we can make it simpler, we can automate some things that are economically justified. They begin to get smarter, and that's a great opportunity to get the methods and procedures and the right kind of technologies. The last one, to me, has been the critical one, and that's, interestingly, the one element of a warehouse management system that I noticed hasn't been improved upon since we created these original designs, years ago. I mean, there's an LMS out there now, and there's a TMS out there now, and we were touching on those early on, but bright people have come along and said there's another way to do that, and so they've got these bolt-ons. But for the most part, the measurement piece is weak, hugely weak. So we're not getting the feedback mechanism to really know how we're doing, not just, pigeon. I just got distracted. Somebody ought to tell them how to get pigeons out of a warehouse. There's somebody here who knows how to do that, right? So measurement, timely and accurately, good productivity. Oops, Wrong button. A real difference, understanding the difference between productivity and performance. There's a whole field out there that hasn't been touched well, in my opinion. Labor management's great, but labor management's only part of how well we're using. And that's what a warehouse management system was intended to do. Help us use all of the resources in a warehouse. The building, the storage systems, the material handling equipment, the people. How do we use them all effectively together? The WMS was intended to help us do that as a good management support. So we got a good measurement and reporting system. So, the outcomes of a successful warehouse management system project for us is to achieve and sustain world-class results. We want really great results. How do we know that? Well, I believe, and we've had lots of experience, whether it's been as a part of a new one, or it's a part of a retrofit, or it's a part of a company who's not getting what they need, maybe it's a couple of years later or whatever. We can do, you can do. You can go through these steps yourself to revitalize that whole relationship. Any effort that you can do will make a difference. So what we've talked about is what we think are the 5 core principles. An articulated, clear vision of your WMS. What is it that you really want to have happen? I like to use the words now, the desired outcomes. What do you really want to have happen? A deep understanding of stakeholder requirements. What do they really need? Not just in historical data, but reach out and touch them. Figure out what they need. Figure out what it is that they weren't aware that they needed. It only happens through conversation. An educated and intelligent operations management and staff. Move them outside the box. Not just the way we've always done it, but get outside of the warehouse, find somebody else. Even if you go to someplace else and you say, gee, that's the dumbest place I've ever been, I can't understand why they're doing it, talk with them. Maybe it is dumb. Maybe they've got some business objectives that you aren't aware of. That's getting deeper. That's getting beyond the surface. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but in a big construction project, you know, where they've dug out a city block and that sort of thing, and they put up this plywood around, they drill holes in there so we can look what's going on. We're observers. Humans are observers. Seldom have I heard anybody ever ask, why do they do it that way? It just keeps coming and going, coming and going. Interestingly, who did the planning? Well, they weren't on site, but if somebody wasn't doing that planning, those cement trucks, concrete trucks, they're down the street blocking traffic. They'd get tickets like that for crazy. Well, maybe you've even had a situation where there wasn't good scheduling on your receiving dock on Monday morning, and the cop comes by and says, you got to do something about this because you're blocking traffic, and it's your operations that are creating that problem. How do we begin to do that? That's all part of that education. The robust design, I can't emphasize enough, re-engineering is critical. Without the re-engineering, you're just going to automate what you already got, and the problems are just going to become more extreme and faster and problematic. And I've been in a couple of those that were really a disaster. And then a performance and measurement reporting system so that you know what you're accomplishing, both for the purposes of validating that you made a great investment, but that you're continuing to improve. Not that you just got up there and it becomes flat, but how do you know that you're making continuing change over time? Because without it, you don't know. I mean, basics. You can't measure it, you can't change it. So, 2 questions. A little participation here. Think about it for a minute. How well is your warehouse performing now? Think about it for a second. And then think about what you might do tomorrow, or when you get back, to improve the operations in your WMS. I'll give you a minute or 2. Maybe say something to your neighbor. How do you feel about what you're doing now, and what would you do tomorrow? I'd like to think that something that I said here today would stimulate to you to think about, gee, there is something I can do that we haven't done, that we could do tomorrow to start. Because all of these can continue for on and on for forever. But you've got to get them started. It's probably your responsibility. And if you don't do it, maybe nobody else will. Anybody got some thoughts they'd like to share with the rest of us? Okay. So, what was discussed? A lot about warehouse management systems and how to get the most out of them, how to improve them or get the most out of them when they're installed or when they're purchased and implemented, how to get more out of them after you got them going, 6 months, a year, 5 years, whatever. Before you go to buy a new one, make sure that the one that you have doesn't have the functionality that you already need. I've run into that many times. What are the benefits to your organization? You're going to get a much clearer understanding of the benefits, the return. You're going to get a smarter workforce. You're going to be more effective. You're going to be moving toward that world-class performance. And you've begun to think about what next steps might be. These are members of APMHC, and most of them are somewhat familiar with what we do. But I want to say also, for more information, you could contact us, obviously.